just thinking a little bit about language again, and specifically about the conditions under which language kind of evolved, I guess. You know, because I don't know how long language has been around, 100,000 years maybe? I don't know, really. But it must have evolved under conditions, physical conditions, exactly like our own. You know, we haven't changed biologically and physiologically in 100,000 years, and the world certainly hasn't changed that much in terms of its, gravity hasn't changed or anything like that. So, so language evolved in the physical conditions and the embodied conditions that we find ourselves now, but it didn't evolve in the same conceptual, philosophical, scientific conditions that we find ourselves now. And I'm just wondering, you know, what's missing from the language, or what constraints is the language placing upon us because of its origins? And by that I don't mean vocabulary. It's always easy enough to invent new words, that's a piece of cake. It's more about the actual language itself, and probably language at a deep level. I don't know if there's any credibility in Chomsky's ideas to do with deep grammar and that whole thing about mental ease that Steven Pinker talks about. I don't know to what extent that's valid, but if it is, presumably the same things apply. That kind of deep understanding of language, the deep grammar of language, whatever the language of thought, if you like, presumably also evolved in the in those same conditions, and the same absences would be there. Having said that, vocabulary isn't terribly important, I mean, I think there's some things revealed in vocabulary. I mean, when people are around looking for new names for new subatomic particles, they have to basically make stuff up, you know, and one of them is called a quark, isn't it? And that's a word that's taken out of, I think it's Finnegan's Wake, probably. I think it's one of those. It's certainly a James Joyce book. So there is something about vocabulary, but as I say, vocabulary can be extended infinitely. We can always make new sounds in our mouths and attribute those sounds to some new phenomenon. But it's more about the syntax and the grammar and the parts of speech and the way those things are worked out. I mean, even something as simple as the tenses of verbs. You know, we have this kind of various versions of the past, present and future tense. And that's kind of mapped onto a particular understanding of time, which only, as I say, applies to bodies like ours doing the kind of things that we do. It wouldn't apply if you were the size of a galaxy, and it wouldn't apply if you were the size of a proton. The different kind of time functions in those scales. Time has a different value. What else? Yeah, there's these parts of speech as well. We have these parts of speech which seem to correlate to the physical world around us. There's something very Newtonian about speech, I think, in that regard. It seems to operate at the level of medium-sized pieces of machinery. But parts of speech kind of describe the bits of those machines, those Newtonian machines, and a fairly Newtonian world. You know, these nouns kind of correlate to medium-sized objects that we're surrounded by, and the verbs correspond to the kind of actions that we as humans routinely engage with, and all the rest of the stuff, the adjectives and the participles and this, that and the other, all those kind of things, as I said, map, probably imperfectly, but they seem to map onto the needs of our operation in a medium-sized world. I'm wondering what other parts of speech, what's hidden from that. I mean, it's almost impossible to think about. It's like trying to imagine what a television station is like when you can't tune into it. You know, what pieces of grammar are missing? What pieces of syntax are not available to us? Is there a whole set of other parts of speech that we could be using, but our brains aren't evolved to think in those terms? So we've never had the need to kind of close or cloak or mask our speech, using our thoughts, using those imaginary parts of speech. Excuse me. we have this kind of clunky, as I say, clunky Newtonian, medium-sized, heavy engineering language. And often we're trying to explore very subtle landscapes of thought, which really aren't describable in those terms, possibly. Not because, as I say, the vocabulary is lacking, but because the grammar doesn't shape itself to the words. I'll tell you what it reminds me, actually, of. What image is coming to mind whilst I'm talking about this. It's reminded me of a scene in the film Stalker by Tarkovsky. Brilliant film from the early 1970s, Russian filmmaker Tarkovsky. It's a very long film, it's very slow moving, quite complex and very ambiguous. But part of it is, it's about these three guys, these two guys and this guy called a stalker, who's basically kind of a tracker or a guide, who want to go into this forbidden land, this forbidden area called the Zone, which is this broken apart semi-industrial area that looks like Ukraine, I guess. It looks like Chernobyl now. And they want to go into this zone because there's this myth of a room at the centre of this strange zone that gives you whatever your heart desires. But there's also a kind of suggestion of a curse attached to it. It's a very strange film. And they make various journeys towards this zone. But at one part of it, to enter into this forbidden zone, one of these guys gets these bolts, nuts actually, the bits that you screw onto big pieces of machinery, really big ones, about, I don't know, 1.5 inches across, something like that, and he ties little strips of white cloth to these bolts, and then he kind of swings them and throws them ahead of himself, like you're throwing something for a dog. He just kind of throws these things, and I don't know. It's not revealed what would happen if, what the problem is. But it's always like he's throwing it into a minefield, waiting for an explosion. But he throws these things into the path ahead of him as he's walking, and it feels a little bit like that's what we're doing with language. We've got this Newtonian language, which is clunky and kind of steam-powered and hydraulic and all those kind of things. And we're living in this world which is made of information and made of quarks and protons and leptons and all this stuff which aren't describable in it. But and the only way we can move into it is by getting these little clunky bits of medium-sized Newtonian syntax and just kind of pitching them out there to see if we can find our way into it. I don't know, maybe.